So there you go. Half a day and good morning. Thank you all for joining us. And I know many of you have been waiting on the sidelines, just waiting for us to turn this on for public. So thank you so much. You're viewing the very last day of the Coalition's 2021 No More webinar, and we're focusing on identifying and responding to stalking. Yes, we're going to see Jennifer Landheis, and this is going to be her last day with us, but it will certainly not be the end. And you will more than likely see her soon in the future as we are trying to negotiate more training. So on that note, yes, yay, some of you are already exercising your fingers on the chat. You know where that is, as well as Q&A. So please introduce yourself. It's great to see who's in the house as we are logging on. Appreciate those of you who have been with us since day one. And for those of you who we just sent the Zoom link on late yesterday, thank you for joining us for this fourth day, actually. And so just wanted to point out too, as we begin with our sessions here, we will start at the top of the hour. So just wanted you to also begin noting if you have any questions in the chat from yesterday or the day before that too. So we can at least get a sense of having you know whatever comments you may have. And oh, yay, we've got folks all the way across from Northern Mariana Islands from Saipan. So thank you for joining us. I know we have those from Palau, from Japan, and also from Honolulu signing in as we speak. So thank you for joining us as well. So as I hear the bells from across the street telling me that we are at the top of the hour, we'll go ahead and continue. And just as a reminder, wanted to say, please, if you are looking for the webinar materials, it is on our website. Click on the blue login button, and that will ask you for your username. The username is the word stalking. Password is case sensitive. It's SAR, all caps, 2021. So check that out. And thanks to Jennifer, our original 200 plus page PDF document of her slides have actually been parceled out by days. So we will be posting that up, and hopefully our web administrator will be nice enough to get that to us by the end of this webinar this morning for us. So thank you so much for checking it out, and at least you'll be able to have the specific information by days as well. As a reminder, continuing education units, one CEU is available. As we've mentioned before, you need to contact University of Guam directly for that. And the email is there, pip@triton.edu.uog.edu. Information again is on our website. The forms you can download, and it will also remind you where to send that to. So we do dabble in Facebook. We have a Twitter account, and we also Instagram. And on occasion, we upload and update information on our blog. So we've got that as well. But more importantly, much of the information, if you would like updates to our events or even our calendar, check us out at www.guamcoalition.org. So on that side, besides webinar materials, we've got our latest news, information, as well. If you're interested in a position with the coalition, you can also check out that site. Just wanted to call your attention to, we have an online community resource directory. So if you're looking for that agency, you will be able to find more information on our Pacific Region Resources.org site. And yes, we do oftentimes get calls for others, and we'll be able to direct you to agencies who can further assist. So here's an add-on. Just wanted to put in a plug. It's only February, but April is what, 2 months away, 3 months, 2.5 months away. So we are all already looking at planning the coordination of events and activities that we hope will occur this April. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it is also Child Abuse Awareness Month, as well as National Crime Victims' Rights Week. So we want to better coordinate these activities so we're not trying to decide, okay, which one will I attend? Especially with everything going virtual, I'm pretty sure, like you, my computer can only hone in or focus in on one event at a time. So join us. We're looking at partners who wish to participate. We have our very first Zoom meeting that we're calling next week, Wednesday, February 10 at 2 p.m. It is a Zoom meeting, so please email. That email address is info@guamcoalition.org. We would really like to have you join us and participate in the, it's not so much a planning, but more like a coordination of what all of our different agencies are doing. So we'd like for you to participate and join us with that. And just a reminder, last year, because of the pandemic, we pretty much canceled all of our April events. So this time around, we want to make sure we don't forget that. And as we've become accustomed to working with this pandemic, this will be something certainly that we can recognize here on our island and celebrate the awareness of. So just a reminder, of course, we want to thank you for participating, but please also don't forget to submit your evaluation surveys. This is the link, but if you go on our website, also it will show you the link to the evaluation as well. And you'll get a reminder. It'll say it's coming from me, but that's actually Zoom sending out those notices saying, thank you for attending. Please don't forget the evaluation, and here's the link. So yes, your input is valuable to us. And to date, last check late yesterday, there were over 135 surveys that were accounted for. Uh, so thank you to all who have been doing this diligently, and especially the day of or the day after to make it easier. So on that note, just wanted to say thank you. But as we move forward, before we start, I know we've got a few more minutes still. I just wanted to take a quick poll. So I'm going to launch this poll and ask you, okay, can you see the poll?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yep.
so the question is, for those of you who have participated in our trainings, especially on Zoom, just want to ask, which format do you prefer? It's going to ask for one. So if you don't know the difference with Zoom webinar and Zoom meeting, Zoom meeting is pretty much like any of our events and our meetings where you are able to sign in and we can see your face and we can hear you talk. So the challenge is, though, when we have a speaker, it's going to be managing the quietness in the audience. So there might be a dog barking and you don't hear that. So we'll have to be able to monitor that, but then that will make it easier for you to engage in conversation rather than taking the time, because oftentimes I'm thinking, oh no, I want to answer, but it's taking me too long to answer. Yes, we get that too. Now with Zoom webinar, it's easier for us to have our trainers better focus in getting the message out. And yes, that doesn't mean you don't participate. We've seen that many of you are quite active on the chat as well. So there are, opportunities there. And another tool that is listed is Microsoft Teams. The reason why it's there, we haven't conducted any of our training before on Microsoft Teams, but it is our understanding that our federal partners who wish to be more actively involved are not able to get on Zoom. Zoom is prohibited in some agencies, so they use Microsoft Teams. We have access to that, but just wondered if that would be something that you would be interested in. Should we do another conference or training utilizing that platform? And then I know there's that question. It depends. So it depends on, now that's an answer that Jennifer shared with us. Remember in day one, everything she, if she would respond to, it was sometimes neither yes and neither no, and it depends. So I thought I'd put that up there as an option too. So I've got about 50% of you voting. Anyone else care to submit? I'm going to leave it up for another minute or so, and take a moment, please. And I know some of you are on your phone devices and may not be able to respond quickly, but this is an anonymous survey, an anonymous poll. So I'm not going to go back and check it out and say, I wonder who said they would prefer Zoom meeting over Zoom webinar. So please, minutes almost up. We're at 30 seconds. So a quick moment for those of you, if you're interested or if you haven't voted. We've got about 75% voting. Well, that's really quite a great response, if I may say. So I'm going to count down now. 10, 9. Okay, we'll quickly go. So it's now at 7, 6. Okay, last moment. 3, 2. Okay, I'm ending the poll right now. Quick, get it in. Okay, thank you. And so here are the results. So it looks like we'll continue with the Zoom webinar. And when we have meetings like our April Planning Committee, we'll use the Zoom meeting because we certainly want to engage you with that. And when we have any other virtual outreach events, we'll use our Zoom meeting platforms. So just want to say thank you so much for participating in that. So now that I've got you all geared up, I'm pretty sure you'd rather hear more from Jennifer. So on behalf of the Guam Coalition, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Cynthia Cabot. I'm assuming you all know who I am and are very familiar with my voice by now. But thank you so much for joining us. Just want to say that we have Nathan, also with the Guam Coalition, who is our ASL interpreter signing, and he's got his team partner there who will be assisting. And in the background, Taylor, Dwayne, and Polly Ron are in the house as well, assisting with any technical assistance you may have. And if today you're still having problems logging on, please call the office or or relay the message to that person to call the office, as that may be a faster response instead of email. So on that note, we have Jennifer. You've met her how many times? And our caption partners are ready on board. Thank you so much for joining us. So you're on, Jennifer, and thank you again. And here's Jennifer.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 4. So you've made it through the last several days. So congratulate yourself. That's a long time spent listening to me. So thank you for that. I would love to spend a little bit of time before we delve into our material today, just asking you all to reflect a little bit and tell me a little bit about the last couple days that we have spent together. So if there's anybody who's joining us for the first time today, will you let me know in the chat, just so as I get into the material, I have the heads up. I have a feeling I'm starting to recognize names now, so I have a feeling many of you are braving day 4 here with all of us. But I would love to hear from all of you some of the takeaways that you have from this training. What are some of the things that were either surprising to you, some things that you might do differently now in your work with victims and offenders, anything that you wished we would have talked about that we haven't talked about, because there's still time. I can still add it last minute. Or anything else that you would wish to share with other folks. I would love for you all to take a chance to put some of that in the chat. It's so different to not be able to be in person and be able to have those conversations during a break or before the meeting starts. So I'd love to hear from all of you some comments that. So someone asked, how can vulnerable members of society protect, communicate, and seek assistance from government agencies that don't respond or are dismissive or even passively abusive towards their complaints or concerns about stalking? Excellent question, Tony. I think the thing that I would say is to always think about who we can enlist to have those conversations that might be listened to in a better manner by those people. Sometimes it's we have to engage some of our partners because those governmental agencies might listen better to those partners. Sometimes it's through demonstrating a need. So oftentimes when we hear from folks who are feeling like their needs and issues and the special circumstances that they're battling are being ignored, that sometimes it's best to have stories or people sharing their experiences if they're willing to, either in person or through an email or something like that with people. Oftentimes I've had, I can put, for example, here in Idaho, our LGBTQ community gets ignored frequently. And so we've found it effective sometimes to hold listening sessions where we have individuals from the community who have something that they would like to share, host a listening session, and we invite lawmakers and others to come to that. Sometimes we've recorded that because it's a little bit safer than being subjected to those people's comments in person. So those are things that, I think we can think about. I think the question we always have to continue to ask ourselves, no matter where we work or what we do, is who are we intentionally and unintentionally leaving out? Who's the most impacted by our work? And people oftentimes have a tendency to focus on kind of the low-hanging fruit and the things that take longer and are going to involve more discussion and more understanding oftentimes get pushed to the back because we are busy and we have lots to do. But my experience has been when we put communities that are the most impacted at the center of our work, then we do better work. And so one of the things that we have to be thinking about is how are we doing that work in a way that centers those individuals so that we are meeting those needs. And then also making sure that we don't turn to what I see happen in some instances of the manner of like tokenizing someone and saying, well, we really want to work with the LGBT community, so we're going to ask one person to sit on this meeting that we have coming up, and their views are going to represent the entire LGBT community. Not fair, not accessible. Certainly we want to have those voices at the table, but we have to be thinking thoughtfully about how we do that. So I think that whole, I think that's 2 seconds of the thoughts off the top of my head, but that certainly it's a practice rather than a policy. And so it's something we all have to continue to grow and learn and do together. But I think too easily people push it to the side by saying, you know, we're not working with whatever population, or we don't see that many victims of stalking, so we don't have to have that conversation. So always asking yourself, if the people that you're working with and the people that are helping you do this work look like you, act like you, believe like you, then you probably need to widen your circle. Okay. So that's the quick off the top of my head for that particular question. I'm going to look at another one in here. How can you provide services or go about helping someone struggling with a stalker, but the key point of violence is substance abuse? Oof, that's a great question. So one of the things that we would say is, and we're going to actually talk about that in our risk assessment today, is the impact that substance abuse has on stalking situations. Just like with domestic violence, the substance abuse doesn't cause the violence, but it certainly contributes to the violence. And so we have to address both of those things. I've been in court systems or other places where if the substance abuse is identified, then the rush is to immediately say, if we can fix the substance abuse issue that the offender has, then the violence will stop. And that's not usually true. You usually have to fix both of those things. So for instance, if I was working on a case where the stalker was stalking someone and they had substance abuse issues, the recommended plan wouldn't be just substance abuse treatment. It would be substance abuse treatment and working to hold them accountable for their stalking behaviors. The problem is, other than the criminal justice system, there isn't any type of treatment behavior for stalking offenders. People ask me all the time, well, what treatment modality works for stalking offenders? And the research isn't really out there. I mean, people are doing that work. They're trying to work with offenders, but we haven't really figured out what works yet. And I think that's one of the hardest part of my jobs, because I really do wish I had an answer for that. But we haven't really figured it out yet. So, and I see, I'm going to start at the last question that just popped up because somebody asked, do people, it says, do psychopaths stalk their victims? So the question would be, you know, what do we label as mental health issues, and what, you know, we diagnose people with mental health concerns. Certainly, we see instances where people are struggling with mental health issues and they're also stalking somebody. And again, just like with alcohol, the mental health issues don't cause the stalking, but they contribute to it, and it can certainly escalate the danger. So what I would tell you is the statistics would show us that offenders of stalking who have a diagnosed mental health issue, that percentage is actually really small. Lots of people want to think stalkers struggle with mental health issues, but they're struggling with power and control and obsession and all those other reasons that we discussed for stalking. So it's actually a really small percentage. Let's see, what other questions we have? What if both parties struggle with substance abuse? Always a great question, right? And I think I would encourage you to think back when we talked about the impact of stalking and how many victims of stalking feel like nothing is safe for them, and that they struggle with the emotional and physical impacts of stalking. And so sometimes the way to cope with those impacts is substance use, because it numbs them, it allows them to forget what's happening, and it allows them to cope with things on a daily basis. So certainly would recommend that if we have somebody that we're working with, I think the most important thing we can do is acknowledge that it's not uncommon. Many victims will be hesitant to share substance abuse issues with us as helpers because they're worried they're going to be judged for that. So acknowledging that it's a common response and that there's nothing to be ashamed of or feel guilty about, and then helping people find resources that can assist with that. I've worked with lots and lots of survivors who struggle with substance abuse issues because it does allow for them to get through day to day and be able to numb some of that emotional and physical pain. So I would definitely recommend that if we're working on a situation where both parties have substance abuse issues, that we explore the options for substance abuse providers. The problem I've seen with that is it can be expensive to access that assistance, especially inpatient or outpatient help. And so we're usually left with, getting help from nonprofit organizations or from their religious organization or from something like Alcoholics Anonymous, which are all great places to access resources. And so I think we need to be creative in thinking about how we help individuals where financial impacts might be difficult access those services as well, if that makes sense. Okay, let's make sure I got all the ones in that. Okay, I think I got all the ones in the Q&A, and I'm going to go through the chat and make sure I missed any. So somebody's asking, what if a stalker is law enforcement who has this fatal attraction syndrome to their estranged wife? How do you respond to those cases? Ugh, those are some of the hardest ones. It's not unusual to have somebody who has law enforcement background or military background as a stalker. If you think about the individuals who are likely to be in the military or to be law enforcement, they oftentimes have power as a big piece of who they are, right? And that spills over into their relationships. And so if we have a law enforcement officer, we have to be thinking about what options outside of the system might be better for the victim. So the victim might not want to report to law enforcement because there's stalkers in that department. Is there an outside department that could address it? Is there somebody in that person's command staff that can hold the stalker accountable? Many times victims are hesitant to bring it up to the department because they fear kickback to the offender, and then those consequences will then cause problems for them. So when the offender is law enforcement, what we typically say when we go, say for instance, into a law enforcement agency and train just law enforcement, is one of the first things that we will recommend to them is you better have a policy on your officers using domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking as a tool, because you're going to have offenders that work for you, and you better have a policy about how you treat that particular situation, because all the time people try to handle it in-house, and that's not effective. So it's certainly a risk factor in those particular things. And then you add access to a weapon on top of things, which always makes things more dangerous. And so in those particular cases, the first point is to figure out who the victim wants to tell and what they're hoping for as an outcome. Do they want the offender held accountable? Are they willing to have those conversations with the people who can hold the offender accountable? Or are they simply wanting to be safer? And so then we're focused on the safety aspect of things, which we're going to talk a lot about today when we talk about safety planning. All right. How much work have we done with universities in regards to stalking in Title IX? Not enough. We're still doing a lot. One of the things that we're struggling right now with is the new Title IX policies that were implemented a couple of years ago and the impact that has on stalking cases. We're in the process of developing guidance and materials for colleges and universities so we can help them come up with policies on stalking. We can help them with training. So for those of you, I know there's lots of you from community colleges and stuff on this webinar. If you would like to host additional training for your organization, reach out to us at Spark. I'm going to walk you guys through our website today and show you where to request an additional training. So you can certainly ask for a training from us, and we do specific training for colleges on how to identify and respond to these issues. Lots of which you've already seen in the last couple of days. There's some components that are the same. but also helping them identify, who's most at risk, who do victims talk to. It's never the college, it's always their friends. And how do you do education on your campus? So one of the things that I would suggest to all of you that are working on universities is to use Spark's website. And remember, on the very first day, I'm going to tax everybody's memory. On the very first day, I said we had training modules on our website. So we actually have PowerPoints and activities and lots of stuff that you've heard the last couple of days that you can just download, and it's like a training in a box. And you can use it to do education on your own campus. So we can't train students. I know. I don't know why we can't. We have to train people who are responding to these situations. So we could come and do a webinar, or we could do an in-person training. I know that we've been talking with the coalition about, once we are able to do in-person training, we would love to come down and spend several days. So we could certainly work with some of you to try to coordinate that, or provide a virtual training, because who knows when we get to travel again. To be able to train your Title IX officers, your campus response folks, if you have security or other people who are working on campus. So that's kind of a long answer to that particular question. Somebody said, discussion of how prosecutors need to get counseling for themselves and give themselves a break from these cases. Yeah, I would totally agree with you, John. I would actually say for any of us that are doing this work, right? The secondary trauma that comes from working on these particular cases. People ask me all the time, how do you continue to do this work? You've been doing it for 23 years. And part of it is a really great self-care plan. I spend lots of time taking care of myself. And I used to, when I was young, think that that was selfish. And now I realize it's not only the best gift that I can give myself, but it's the best gift that I can give the survivors that I work with if I'm not burnt out. So definitely encouraging all of you, whether you're a prosecutor or whatever role you fill, take care of yourself. It's a really, you can't pour from an empty cup. So you can't continue to give to people if you don't have anything left to give, all right? Somebody said they learned more about what actually defines stalking. That's awesome. Okay, anything else that I've missed? So many victims don't want offender charged with a crime. Yeah, they just want to get help, but there's a limit with what we can do if that person doesn't want to engage the system. I totally agree. I think the thing that we also have to keep in mind is sometimes it's easy to feel frustrated on those cases where we either we can't access the criminal justice system, the victim doesn't want to access the criminal justice system, or the criminal justice system wasn't effective in that particular case. And I think sometimes, and you'll hear my little soapbox here. So my soapbox has always been, and I remember the first time I said this to someone, I was at a presentation, and this older gentleman raises his hand and he says, "How successful are you in your work?" And he was trying to set me up, right? And I looked at him and I said, 100%. And he said, "You mean that every victim that you work with gets justice in the criminal justice system?" And I said, "Sir, I think we have a disagreement about what justice is." And I said, "Every person who comes into my office is listened to, believed, and provided with resources. And I can tell you that for many people that I have worked with, the fact that somebody believed them and that somebody listened to them is the justice that they were looking for. So I can tell you that 100% of the people who come through and that I interact with, I'm successful with, because I provided them with that listening ear and with that element of justice." He didn't like my answer, but I liked my answer. All right. Let's see. Yeah, so Monica's expressing appreciation that our team is victim-centered and that more law enforcement needs to be trained in being victim-centered. I totally agree with you, Monica. And if Mark were on here, he would be very willing to tell you from the very start that he was not. He said terrible things to victims. He did awful things in these cases because he didn't know any better. And that's not unusual. Lots of law enforcement that I train with are very quick to say, I was the person that you all hated in the beginning, but somebody cared enough to get me to change my ways. And some people change, some people don't. Certainly, I wish we had responders across the board, no matter what their profession, that were more victim-centered. But it's a work in progress for all of us, right? And I think our team especially has a very open conversation about accountability and being victim-centered, and realizing that we all try and that we always can improve on that. So thanks to the shout out about the team. I think they're in a pretty amazing team. And I'm pretty proud of the work that we all do, but know that it's always a work in progress. And I know that Mark would be very willing to say that, you know, it took 25 years of people working with him for him to be at where he's at right now. And same for me. You know, I always say the minute I stop learning from all of you, time for me to retire. All right, additional comments or questions that I missed? That was fun. Thank you all for participating and actually putting stuff in there. It's always helpful for me to know what's like resonated with all of you and been helpful for all of you, and to hear some of your comments about what we've talked about. So excellent. Please continue to ask questions as we go throughout today. And just because I disappear from your screen at the end of today does not mean I disappeared. You will all have my contact information. You've got Jane's contact information. Certainly can put you in touch with Mark if that's something you want to be in touch with as well. So yeah, so someone's making the comment, you know, victim-centered is different than victim-controlled, certainly. So all remembering that, you know, we have specific roles that we have to engage in and be part of, but making sure that as we look at this process, doing so in a way that has the least negative impact on the individuals that we're working with in that manner. So somebody also said it's surprising to learn about the methods and devices. So the technology stuff has improved convenience and access. So the webinar gave you a better perspective about guarding your private information. Awesome. By practicing more safety precautions. Yeah, I'm that person everybody hates in a store because they're always like, what's your phone number? And I say, I don't give that out. I'm like, what? You shouldn't see the reactions I get from people. All right. So it looks like we made our way through quite a few of those. Oh, I see one more popping up here. Oh, good. I'm glad some of you are saying it's giving you some actual resources. So I'm a big believer when we talk about trainings that it's one thing for me to, you know, give you a different way to think about stalking, et cetera. It's another thing for me to give you those practical tools that can be really helpful in your everyday work. And lots of you are phenomenal at your job. You wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't, okay? But I think it's always nice to think about those practical things that you can use in your ongoing work. So I'm a big fan of trying to make sure you have access to those. So we will make sure that we point out on our website where you can find all the stuff I've been talking about the last couple of days. So, all right, we are going to go ahead then and start some of our time together today. So nobody said that this was their first training, so we're not going to go over the definition of stalking again because I don't need to, because y'all got it down by now. You could write an essay on it. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I love it. All right, so we are going to instead start off our time today talking about threat assessment. And what is threat assessment and what does that look like and how do we do threat assessment in stalking cases? And I wanted to also acknowledge that Mark yesterday talked about what he called diff patterns. And DIF again stands for the duration, the intensity, and the frequency. And we look for these particular patterns in stalking cases to help us identify some of the cases that are at a higher level of danger. And it also can help us prove intent in some of these particular cases. So by duration, we just mean how long the stalking has been going on. So the average duration for an intimate partner stalking case is 2.2 years. For other non-intimate partner cases, it's 1.2 years. Now, certainly all of us have worked with individuals who have been stalked for years and years and years. So one of the things that we keep in mind when we're looking at these particular cases, the longer the stalking behavior has been going on, the more intense these particular situations are, right? That it's kind of a no duh, makes perfect sense, right? We also look at the intensity of these particular situations and what has been happening in these situations and how often the offender is making contact, so the frequency. So intensity, we're going to talk about, and we're going to kind of get a chance to practice what that might look like when we look at some of the case scenarios that we're going to go through today when we talk about safety, et cetera. So one of the things that we know when we talk about threat assessment is that there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Threat assessment is more of an art than a science, if that makes sense. That it's, you know, we're still learning some of the research about it. We're still trying to figure out what does this mean in our particular cases. And so one of the things that you need to be thinking about is threat assessment will show us which individuals might pose a risk at a particular point in time. So the thing I really want you to keep in mind is when we do threat assessment in stalking cases, you have heard me say numerous times that in stalking situations, offenders change. They're really dynamic situations. They change all the time. The offenders change their behavior, victims change how they react. And so we can't just do a threat assessment or a safety plan and think that once we do it, we're done. So for example, sometimes what happens is a victim advocate or a law enforcement officer might do a threat assessment, and then they give that information to a prosecutor or somebody else within the system, which is really helpful and something we would recommend if confidentiality allows it. But then no one ever does another threat assessment. And if I do a threat assessment today on a particular case, and I give it to Mark, and Mark investigates it, which is, we all understand now is going to take some time and some resources, right? And then he gives it to Jane. By the time it gets to Jane, the threat assessment that I did initially with the victim isn't really valid anymore because things have changed. And when we look at the system itself, when we involve law enforcement, when we involve prosecutors, does the level of danger in stalking cases go up or go down once all of us in the criminal justice system are involved? Or if, for those of you from the colleges, if a student reports it and they're now going through the campus disciplinary process or Title IX process, does their level of danger go up or go down once we're all involved? Anybody willing to take a guess in the chat? Okay, I see up, up. Anybody else want to hazard a guess? Up. Okay, lots of ups. You are correct. Okay, despite what we want to think, right? We all want to think, oh, we're involved, things are going to get better. Lots of times it gets worse, right? So keep it in mind as the criminal justice system and others outside people get involved that the danger actually goes up, all right? The other thing that we need to keep in mind is we might do a threat assessment or some kind of risk assessment. And we should never be using them to try to say somebody's not a risk. That person might be of unknown risk, but to say they're not a risk is dicey, not something I would recommend. You have all seen media interviews or interviews with family and friends after the unfortunate incidents, if a victim is killed or harmed by their partner. And everybody always says, oh, we never would have expected it. A lot of times the warning signs are there. Okay? So we don't want to say that somebody's not a risk. It could be an unknown risk. And as I said, the threat level is never fixed. It changes frequently. So we have to be keeping that in mind. So if you're going to choose to, say, for instance, use a threat assessment, it would be something that I recommend you use on like a rolling basis. So something that people use all the time, okay? So one of the things that we want to consider then is thinking about when we're looking at these particular cases. Tools are great, right? But victims' perceptions of risk are always going to be much more accurate than any tool. So what I'm going to tell you is, if you use the tool that we're going to go through and it doesn't really predict a really high risk in a particular situation, but the victim is telling you, I am convinced that this person's going to harm me or to kill me, you need to listen to the victim. Okay? Because victims usually have a much better predictor of risk than any tool that exists out there. And that's proven by research. The research is at the bottom of the screen if anybody's a research nerd and wants to look up that particular study. Okay? So the tool that we're going to spend some time on today and talk about is the SHARP assessment. And SHARP stands for the Stalking, Harassment, Assessment, and Risk Profile. Okay, I'm not going to expect you to all remember that. Okay, I can usually never remember what it stands for. I would just always call it SHARP. And the thing that I really like about SHARP is it gives us two things. It gives us a risk profile and like a narrative report, but it also gives us safety planning suggestions. And this is what I would say to you. This does not replace safety planning with victims. Okay, it does not replace those ongoing conversations you have. It does not replace referring somebody to an advocate or someone else who might have more expertise in safety planning. Now, law enforcement and prosecutors oftentimes say, well, I'm really good at safety planning, Jennifer. And oftentimes they have a really great skill set, but a lot of times it's focused on the physical safety planning. So we want to think really comprehensively about the emotional impact as well. And so the reality might be that we all do safety planning in our work. I 100% believe that. Some of us have more experience and some of us have more time in being able to do that. So I like the fact that SHARP gives us not only the assessment, but the safety plan, because I'm human. And I have safety planned with victims before and they have left, and I think, oh, shoot, we should have mentioned X, or we should have talked about Y, and I forgot about it, right? Or I have worked with victims who are experiencing the ongoing trauma of stalking, and they leave and they forget what we talked about. And so having a written document that has the safety plan can be helpful, okay? And then you'll also hear me talk later about how it can't just be a document. One of my favorite mantras is that safety planning is a verb, meaning it's something we do on an ongoing basis. It's not a noun. It's not a piece of paper that we pull out of our desk drawer and go over with victims of domestic violence or sexual assault, okay? So keep in mind that this is going to be, that's why I said safety planning suggestions. I didn't call it a safety plan, okay? So the other thing that we need to be thinking about is SHARP analyzes specific risk factors in stalking situations. It looks at the big picture it looks at what the stalker's mindset is, as well as the stalker's history and how vulnerable our victim is. Now, the person who created SHARP is the same researcher who came up with the SLY strategies. So she happens to be from the University of Kentucky. She's what I would consider to be the leading researcher in the country on the issue of stalking. Okay? And she came up with this assessment because we kept saying, I really wish we had a way to have a common language and a common way about talking about the dangers in these particular cases. So she did lots of research and came up with SHARP. And the 4 categories have subcategories. So when we look at the big picture, we're looking at the course of conduct that's happening in these particular cases. How do we know what the course of conduct is? What framework can we use to look at course of conduct? This is your final test, people. What framework did we talk about the very first day? Can you remember? SLY, yay! Nice answer, good job. Someone gets 100% on the final. All right, yes. So it looks at the course of conduct, it looks at the SLY strategies, all right? It also looks to see if there's been an escalation in these particular cases. So what has been happening? Are things getting more intense? And what are the nature and the context of the threats that are being made in this particular situation? What's the difference if we have an offender who says, I'm going to kill you, and an offender who says, I'm going to bury you behind my grandma's shed and nobody will ever find your body? What's the difference in those 2 threats? Or isn't there a difference? Plan versus no plan. Absolutely, Taylor. Okay, so one of those has a specific plan. So the more specific the plan and the more specific the threats, the more danger we're in. So you're exactly right, John, that specificity makes it more dangerous, okay? We're also going to look at the stalker's mindset. Now, keep in mind, this isn't what the stalker says their mindset is. This is what we believe to be the mindset. So one of the things that we can be thinking about is what are their motive? Oh, we have a question. So someone's asked, do you suggest to document the reaction of an individual who demonstrates risk to others, just in case we will have evidence to prove the pattern or history of a potential stalker? I would say it depends on the work that you're doing, Yvonne. If you are, working in a particular situation where you keep detailed case notes like that, certainly always helpful. If we're concerned about somebody's safety, et cetera, definitely want to be thinking about how we keep those type of case notes. So yes, I would consider that documentation. I would also consider working with victims to keep that documentation and sharing it with other people in their family or somebody else. Okay. So back to our lovely stalker's mindset, we are looking at what the offender's motive is if they're engaging in proxy stalking. So question 2 in the final, what's proxy stalking? Y'all are gonna start logging off the webinar because you didn't realize there was a final today. What's proxy stalking? Using someone else, yes, all right. Yep, so using other people to access the victim, exactly right, okay. Access to weapons is a concern, and the resistance and persistence. So the amount of resistance that the victim has put up. So has the victim told the offender they don't want to be involved with them? Have they gathered a civil protection order or applied for have they applied for a civil protection order? Have they reported to law enforcement? What has the victim done to resist the offender's behavior? And how persistent has our offender been? Is the offender still contacting even though there's a civil protection order in place? Are they still showing up at the victim's work even though they've been trespassed from that area, okay? And then we're looking at the stalker's history. a history of control and jealousy and violence towards other people, past violence and abuse towards other people. So not only the coercive control part of domestic violence, but the physical and sexual aspect as well. But not only with former intimate partners, but with other people. So if this is somebody who, fights people at the bar, that's past violent behavior. The criminal justice history, and then the substance abuse and mental health history. So remember, like I said yesterday, it's not going to be unusual to have an offender who has no criminal justice history, okay? And thank you for whoever asked the question about substance abuse earlier, because you've already heard my little spiel on mental health issues and substance abuse, about whether they're contributors and not the reason for the violence, okay? And then last but not least, we're looking at the level of fear that the victim is experiencing, how tech savvy our offender is, and how vulnerable our victim is. So keep in mind then that we're going to be looking at some of the SLY strategies as part of this behavior, okay? So what we're gonna actually do after the break, because first we're gonna take a break, because once we start down this road, it doesn't make sense to take the break in the middle of the case scenario. So this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna take a 10-minute break. After our break, we are gonna come back and I'm gonna show you a video about a particular situation. And then we're gonna actually do SHARP together, which is always a little bit risky move on my part, because that means I'm going to be actually opening the SHARP website and sharing my computer screen with all of you. And that can be a little risky because, it's the internet and we all know how stable the internet can be sometimes. But we're gonna actually go through a SHARP assessment together, because this has been my experience. When I've done training and I've just been like, hey, you should do SHARP, people are like, oh yeah, that sounds really great, we'll totally use it. And then I'll go back to that jurisdiction in a year and I'll be like, hey, tell me how that, use of SHARP is going. And they're like, oh yeah, we didn't ever use that, okay? So if we actually go through the assessment together, number one, you guys get to see what's on it, but you get to see how it works and how it gives you the factors, et cetera. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break. So come back at, it would be what, 10:03 for you all? Someone correct me if I did the math incorrectly, but come back in 10 minutes and then we will go ahead and do the assessment.
Yes, that's 10:03.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia.
Sure, thank you.
Dated, if you're wondering like, why wasn't this happening? But we share this story in particular. This story is the reason that we have Stalking Awareness Month. So we are going to watch a video. We're going to go about halfway through this particular story, and then we're going to do SHARP based on everything that we've talked about and heard. And then we're going to watch the conclusion of the video to see what happened in this particular case. So this video is closed captioned. So for my interpreters, you'll have a little bit of a break here while we watch the video, and then we'll go ahead and do SHARP together. So hold on one second, I'm gonna stop my video. Okay.
It all began in the fall of '98. At the age of 28, my sister Peggy began preparing for medical school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She met and began dating a man named Patrick Kennedy. In the beginning, it seemed like a very fine relationship to me. They were dating, doing dating things, going to movies, but I noticed a switch in Peggy's personality. I just knew something wasn't right with my sister, and I wasn't sure why. Peggy and Patrick's relationship lasted about 3 years altogether. In March of 2002, Peggy cut all ties with him. From the day she left him, he began stalking her. Calling her on her cell phone, begging her to come back, threatening her. He waited outside of her work. He waited outside of her gym, just watching her till it was a sort of a sign to let you know that I'm there and I'm watching her every move. He wanted her back in his life, and until he did, he was just going to persist with it. At one point, Peggy had called me in the afternoon and said, "You'll never believe this. Patrick jumped out of the bushes at work with a dozen roses and a wedding ring and asked me to marry him." And Peggy said, I walked right by him, I got in my car and drove away. Peggy was very, very strong and very determined to shake this man from her life. And the more she ignored him, the angrier he got. Then he progressed to paperwork. He made a really nice 8.5 by 11 flyer with a photo of my sister on it, wrote all sorts of incredible obscenities about her, and put her cell phone number on it, and distributed it where she had her nails done, where she had her hair cut, where her gym was, where she worked.
She took the flyer to the police and showed them that, but there was nothing they can do. It was only a flyer.
But I think at that point, you know, we were still thinking that he was just playing a game. We didn't think it would escalate. And then he took greater steps because she wasn't reacting.
That June, our family gathered in Orlando, Florida for my brother's wedding. Peggy brought a new man she had begun dating, Mark Sparks.
Patrick knew that we would all be in Florida for this wedding. And he had flown to my mother's house in Poland, Ohio, and on her white garage doors with black spray paint, he sprayed "PK is a whore" on the doors.
Patrick then returned to Albuquerque to set fire to Mark's house.
I noticed I had about 8 messages on my cell phone, and I knew something was wrong. So I listened to the messages. My neighbor, my mother, the police, the fire department were all calling and saying that my house was on fire. Right away, Peggy knew that Patrick had done this.
Peggy and Mark were going from hotel to hotel because they had nowhere to live because Mark's house was set on fire. We were at the point we didn't want Peggy to call us because we didn't know if he was trying to trace a phone call. We didn't want him to find out Peggy's whereabouts. Peggy, it seemed for a while, was just in hiding.
Everything that Patrick did to Peggy, Peggy went and reported it to the police. She was getting very, very, very agitated with them because nothing was being done to stop this man from harassing her.
Patrick's behavior was escalating, and Peggy got a restraining order. She went to the police and filed for stalking charges. The trial was delayed for several months. Nothing was being done.
It was extremely frustrating, and in a time where you're being hunted by somebody and you feel more victimized by going through the system to protect yourself, then what good is it?
And I remember Peggy coming home having a binder of probably 200-300 pages in it of just everything she had documented. Peggy did all the footwork. Peggy did everything. She did everything right, but nobody would help her. Why? I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. So what we're going to do is keep in mind that when we do SHARP, we are going to be looking at some of the sly behaviors that have been happening. So the surveillance, the life invasion, the interference, and the intimidation. Okay. So, and some of you probably have seen this video before. It's available on YouTube, etc. So, okay, let's go ahead and actually try to do SHARP together. So a little patience from all of you as we go through this, just because, you know, I'm navigating the computer in front of all of you, which is always daring on my part. So what we're going to do is actually do the SHARP assessment. So I'm going to share with you the actual website. So everybody able to see the website on your screen? All right. So when you first go to coercivecontrol.org, or you find SHARP on the internet, however you found it, you go to this page and it says a couple of warning things. Number one, it says, hey, by the way, stalkerware and spyware exists. So your computer might be monitored, so you should know that. And if you are a victim who's filling this out, you should consider that as you fill it out, okay? So then you just hit next down here in the corner. And then it gives you a little bit of background on SHARP. And it says, FYI, or for your information, this is going to be 48 questions. And once you answer the questions, what happens is it gives you the risk assessment and the safety plan in a Microsoft document that you have to save. So in other words, what's going to happen is if you fill this out and you go back to your computer and you try to just get back on the site and use your cookies or the cache to take you back to the answers that you put in, it's not going to work. It automatically clears it out as a safety mechanism in case a victim does it on their computer and an offender would find it. So this is telling you, hey, once you answer these, you're going to actually have to keep the file. Okay. And then it also says that Sharp has some layers of security in place, and it tells you why and how that particular security works. And then it says, read the statement below, that Sharp will take about 15 minutes or longer, depending on how you answer the questions. And it's only as good as the answers that you give, okay? It also says, you know, it's a research informed tool. It's not going to give you specific action, but rather use it as a tool in the work that you do. And that by, you know, saying yes to the agreements, you're saying that, yes, I've read all of this and I understand, okay? So now we're to the actual assessment. So one of the first questions it asks us is, what type of situation is being assessed? So we are looking at a situation where we have a male offender, correct? Notice that if you don't know who the offender is, you can choose unknown. Then it asks us for the offender's name or initials. What's the offender's name? It's Patrick Kennedy, and I am actually putting his first name in here because his initials are the same as that of the victim. So I just put Patrick in there. How old was Patrick? Anybody catch that? Do we know? Or are we going to kind of have to guess? Taylor, you are on it. Okay. Patrick's 32 at the time. Okay. Either that was a really great guess, Taylor, or you surmised it from some of the information. And that leads to what I want to point out is everybody's always like, well, what if I don't know the answers to all of these questions? Okay. Oh, somebody's saying that my screen is twirling on your end. Is that happening for other people? I'm scrolling through the assessment, so that might be why, depending on your bandwidth. So for some of you, yes, for some of you, no. So if it's going to, you know, give you a headache to watch, just listen to my voice. I'll read the questions to y'all, okay? So yeah, we have to all give a nod out to the internet, right? Okay. So back to my statement, you might not know the answers to all the questions, and that's okay. So know that that's a possibility, and that's all right, because Sharp asks enough questions that if you don't know the answer to one or two, it's not going to affect the outcome of the results, if that makes sense. So our victim's name is Peggy, obviously, and our victim's gender is female, and the victim's age. Did anybody catch that? How old's Peggy? Yes, she's 28. And the relationship. So note here that it encompasses all the relationships that can happen in stalking situations. So it's not just a domestic violence specific assessment. So their relationship is ex-partner, right? But we could have authority figure, an online, etc. Who's answering the questions? So this is asking us who we are. And we are going to pretend we're all professionals, okay? And then what agency do we work for? So we're gonna all pretend to be law enforcement today, okay? No, you can't leave this training and go do something that only law enforcement can do. I did not deputize you. You have no powers. Are you doing a Sharp assessment to get information about a real case? Yes, we are, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to say no. I'm just practicing or testing the assessment because I use this website all the time when I do training, and I don't want to throw off the data that they're gathering it. if you would all jump on here and you just want to go through a case that you've worked on in the past, you can put, you're just testing this assessment, okay? And then it asks us, what state is this situation occurring in? Yes, it was happening in Ohio at that particular moment in time. Okay. All right, you know what I just noticed? They have a not in the US, which isn't exactly accurate, but they don't have the territories listed on here. Feedback that I will give them, okay? So it started in Ohio. It was also involving New Mexico. So we have numerous jurisdictions here, which is going to be one of the questions. So for those of you that are like, no, it was in New Mexico, hold on, okay? So both are true. So then we are looking at, I'm going to scroll up so you can read it here, what's happening in this particular situation. So we're asking questions about this particular situation, and our choices are no, yes, and suspected. So the first question is, has Patrick been tracking, following, or monitoring Peggy in any way? And the answer is, of course, yes. Has Patrick repeatedly invaded Peggy's life, privacy, by initiating unwanted contact with her, either through phone calls, text messages, breaking into her car? Is he making unwanted contact? Yes. Has he on more than one time intimidated or scared Peggy through threats, property damages, threatening or harming the pets, or other means? I would say setting somebody's house on fire is property damage, yes. Has he significantly and directly interfered with her life? Spread rumors, humiliated her, jeopardized her job? Absolutely. All right. Has Patrick physically or sexually assaulted Peggy while he was stalking her? Yes or no? He had actually not, at that point in time, physically assaulted her that we knew of. Has he forcibly kept Peggy from leaving or held her against her will, made her have an accident, physically assaulted friends or family members, or seriously attacked Peggy in another manner? No. Okay. And we're on to our next page. When did the behavior first start? So what would happen is it calculates the length of a stalking case based on today's date and when it first started. So assuming that it's still ongoing. So we're going to actually have to trick the website right now into picking a day based on how long we think Patrick and Peggy's stalking that she received from Patrick lasted. Did anybody catch on how long this particular situation had been going on? What kind of time frame we're looking at? Three years. Excellent job, Rachel. Okay. So I'm going to trick this into thinking that it's 3 years from today. So I'm going to say January 1st of 2018. Okay. And I'm only doing that for the purposes of this test case. All right. So then it checks my math in case I'm not good at math. And it says, oh, come on. Okay. Based on the date that this has been going on, about 3 years and 1 month, is this correct? And I say yes. Then we're asking about the intensity. Remember the diff pattern? Has Patrick regularly contacted or harassed Peggy in more than one way? No or yes? Yes. Has he bothered her at more than one location, contacted her through her phone or a computer or some other place? Yep. And his behavior increased in frequency and severity? Yes. So these you're going to have to guess at. You would probably have a better idea if you were actually working on this case. It's asking you to think in a typical month, think that a month involves, 30 days. How many days do we think that Patrick was initiating unwanted contact with Peggy? And again, we're just going to guess. Anyone want to venture a guess? Okay, somebody wants to, let's go with every 30 or every day. So 30 days, says Rachel. All right, so in a typical month, how many days do you think he directly approaches Peggy? Sounds like he was doing that a fair amount of time, right? So go with 30 again? Okay. And again, it's okay if these aren't exactly accurate, all right? In a typical month, how often does he interfere with Peggy's life? See some more every days. All right. How many times has Peggy separated or broken up with Patrick? Just once, correct. Has Patrick left objects or made gestures or said things that felt threatening but weren't direct threats in this particular case? Yep. Has he threatened to physically hurt or kill Peggy? Yep. Has he described in detail how he plans to harm Peggy? That one's a no, okay? So remember we talked about specificity earlier. Has Patrick threatened, harassed, or stalked or assaulted others close to Peggy? Yep. Has he threatened to destroy property, harm pets, or sabotage Peggy? Yep. Has he directly or indirectly threatened Peggy with a gun? No. Has he threatened to harm himself? No. Has he made a threat and then did exactly what was threatened or tried to carry out the threat after he threatened it? Any ideas? Okay. There's a little bit of a disagreement in the chat. Some of you are saying no, some of you are saying yes. He had, and you guys wouldn't necessarily know that from the video. Has he had other people like his friends or family threaten or harass Peggy? So the answer to this one is no. He didn't have his friends threaten Peggy, but he had threatened Peggy's family members, which is a different question. Okay. Has Patrick's actions made Peggy afraid or concerned for her safety? And now our answers change. It's either not at all, somewhat, or extremely. Extremely, yep. Have his actions made her concerned for the safety of family members and coworkers? Yeah. Has his actions contributed to her making some significant life changes? Either she's changing her day-to-day stuff. Yeah, she was homeless, right? She's moving back and forth. Does Peggy believe Patrick is capable of harming her? Extremely, probably, right? Is she afraid or concerned about a significant financial or social impact that he's had on her life? Either like a loss of job, loss of housing, deliberate financial harm? Yeah, extremely, because remember, she has moved and is going from place to place, right? Has he been clearly and directly notified that this behavior is unwanted, either informally or formally through like police or civil protection order? Yeah, there's a civil protection order in place, right? Has he persisted in contacting, threatening, or engaging in other unwanted behavior? Yes, okay. He was doing stuff even after the civil protection order. And is there a court order in place? Yes. Notice once I hit yes, it came up with this next question to ask, has he violated that court order? Yes. And for the coalition staff, if I could ask you real quick, I'm going through these questions pretty quickly, and so I don't have my video screen up. So if I'm going too fast for our ASL folks, will you all just let me know, please? Okay, so now our answers are yes, no, suspected, or unknown. Has Patrick been controlling and jealous or physically violent towards Peggy or other people in the past? Okay, so what has he done? Has he been controlling and extremely jealous? Yep. Has he been controlling or extremely jealous with other people? Yeah, starting Mark's house on fire is a little over the top, right? Has he been physically violent with Peggy? Yeah, unknown. So we're not going to check that box. Has he been physically violent with other people? We don't really know about that one either, right? Has he ever threatened or used a weapon on Peggy? Strangled her, severely assaulted her, or sexually assaulted her? Okay, I see no from the gallery. All right. Does he have a criminal history? Drug or alcohol problem? Serious mental health issues? No. Some of you are saying yes. So we might think his behavior is pretty erratic, but it's very typical of a stalker. So he does not have a mental health issue that we know of at this time. He does not also have a criminal justice history or drug or alcohol problems. I mean, okay, so some of you might say yes with a criminal justice history because he was arrested for, and we were awaiting trial. But if he once he's been arrested, he still hasn't been sentenced yet. Remember, they said we're waiting for trial to come up. So it hasn't been, the fancy language that we use in the system, adjudicated yet. So he hasn't been found guilty yet. So we could say yes, we can go with no. We could say suspected. Has Patrick thought about or attempted suicide in the past? Okay, somebody wants to go with unknown. He hadn't, so I'm actually going to say no. Does he have guns or is he obsessed with weapons? Oh, look, remember when we talked about earlier, does he have special military training or a law enforcement background? For those of you that are saying yes, what do you think? Okay, I see lots of unknowns. So we're going to go with unknown. Has Peggy believed Patrick's using technology to monitor her? And then it spells out some of that technology. Suspected. How did you guys get that information? What do you mean you suspect there's technology going on? Tell me what you heard in the video that makes you suspect that. Because you're right. Yes, thank you, Taylor. The family didn't want her to call because they were worried that their calls were being monitored, right? So suspected. Do messages from Patrick suggest he feels rejected and degraded by Peggy in some way? Yeah. Does he indicate he wants revenge or blames her for ruining his life? Okay, I see no. And has Patrick seemed unconcerned about severe consequences like going to jail or dying? Yeah, I would say he's not very concerned because he's setting the house on fire, right? Are there any potential upcoming situations that Peggy's worried might trigger an escalation? Yep, remember the court hearings coming up? Does Peggy feel that she might have sent him mixed messages? She was very clear. She was like, I don't want to have anything to do with you. So she's not concerned about sending him any mixed messages. Does she believe Patrick's aware of the things he's doing upset her? Yes, she got a civil protection order. So she told him that she's concerned. Does she sometimes feel bad for him because he's depressed or he had a hard life or something like that? No. Okay. Has the harassing or threatening behavior previously been reported to the police or to school staff? So for those of you from universities, workplace, yep. Okay, so yes, it was reported. Does Peggy feel there's limited consequences to his behavior? for sure. Does she feel she's more vulnerable to his behavior because there might be things that in the environment that limit her ability to be safe? So he's a neighbor, she's in unsafe housing, intent. She's got limited access to resources. Yes. So notice once I clicked yes, it says, well, what's she worried about? Does she work or go to school at the same place? Is he in a position of authority? So for instance, if he was her professor and she was a student, or he was her boss. Does she live or work near Patrick? Do they have children in common? Does she live in unsafe housing? Yes, because she's bouncing around, right? She has limited access to resources. She's isolated. She probably has limited access to safety measures, okay? And then there's a box that says any other relevant notes. So where this can be helpful and where I would suggest using this is if you're doing a threat assessment, a sharp assessment, and you're giving it to other people, if you would want things in here that the DA would see, or that her civil attorney or somebody else might see that we didn't think about. And I love that Taylor immediately says, what about the travel to the mother's house? So the way that I would put that in here, Taylor, is I would say, so once I say yes, it says, okay, anything else you want to add about the unique circumstances or any other specific safety concerns or recommendations? So what I would put in here is those cases about Mark's house being set on fire and the mom's garage being spray painted. Those cases had not gone through the criminal justice system yet. And in fact, Patrick hadn't even been arrested for those. There were no consequences to him at that moment in time, but they were in process, but they were clear across the country. So the judge or whoever might look at this particular case wouldn't necessarily have access to that if nobody's been arrested. The judge wouldn't have any idea of knowing what else might be happening in a different jurisdiction unless we tell them that information. This is saying hypothetically we're using this for the criminal justice system. So we might say that there are multiple victims in multiple jurisdictions and cases are awaiting adjudication, meaning they haven't been sentenced yet. Okay. All right. So that was it. That's the whole assessment. How long did that take us? Not very long, right? Okay. So for those of you that were like a little concerned by the fact that there was going to be 48 questions, you can see that it doesn't take us that long to actually do the assessment because the questions are yes, no, somewhat, etc. So it really doesn't take that long to be able to do the assessment. And boom, we have our results already. So you can see right here, it says your sharp narrative and risk profile and your sharp safety management tool. So once I click on those, if you'll notice in the bottom left-hand side of my screen, which hopefully you can see, it's downloading a Word document. What do I want to do with these Word documents? Besides open them. Save them, yes. Why do I want to save them, Taylor? Because if I go grab dinner and I come back, are they still there? Yeah, they're not there, right? Okay, so I would save them, right? I'm just going to open them instead because I don't have any need to be able to save them. So you all are going to have to give me 1 second because they're going to open up in a different screen. And I want to actually be able to show them all to you. So I'm going to open them first of all. Okay. So hopefully what's going to happen, so I'm going to stop sharing that screen and I'm going to hopefully share the actual assessment. Okay, can you all see that? Does it say
Yes.
narrative and risk profile? Perfect. All right. The technology powers that be are smiling on me today. Then this is actually all working. All right. So you will see the date that we filled this out, what kind of situation, who filled it out, and then you see a little bit of an explanation on Sharp, so that if I did this and then I gave it to another advocate or Peggy's counselor or somebody, and they didn't know what Sharp was, it explains what it is. And then it says the information is about Peggy, and then it describes the course of conduct. So it's basically saying that Patrick interferes with her life 30 days on a monthly basis. It talks about the diff pattern, that his course of conduct has been going on for 3 years, that he regularly contacts Peggy, and that he's interfering in Peggy's life, okay? Oh, and I see a couple of questions popping up in the chat. Okay, you can all see it. And then it's talking about the threats that Patrick has made, that he's left objects, that he's threatened to harm her or her family members. And based on his actions, that Peggy is extremely afraid or concerned for her safety. Okay. Then we talk about the resistance and persistence, that Patrick's been directly and clearly notified that he should stop, and he is persisting in contacting her. And it gives a context that he's got a history of controlling behavior with her or with other people, that it seems to indicate that he's feeling rejected by Peggy, that he seems unconcerned about the consequences. And then it gives us the risk profile. So it says, based on the information reported, there are several factors that suggest a serious risk profile for this stalking course of conduct. There's some contextual information that's unknown, but if the information becomes known, it would be important to redo Sharp. Okay, so remember when I said earlier, always adding more information if we have it. It goes on to say, below is the summary of the 11 risk factors that are present in this case out of 14. Patrick's been stalking Peggy for a long amount of time. His behavior is increasing in frequency and severity. He's threatened to harm Peggy. He's followed up with those threats. She's afraid for her safety and the safety of other people. He's violated a court order. He feels rejected and humiliated and degraded by her. And Peggy believes that he's aware that what he's doing is bothering her. And we also include the fact that he has a history of being extremely jealous with Peggy. He's capable of using technology. She feels like her home is unsafe, and he's had a history of being controlling and extremely jealous towards other people. So I want to bring up the chat so I can see your reactions. Talk to me about the assessment. What did you think about using it? Do you think it would be helpful for the work that you do, or questions that you have about the Sharp assessment? It's user friendly. Yep. Yeah, it's super easy to use, right? That's why I started actually doing that in training, because when I would just say, oh, go use it, people got too scared of the 48 questions and they never answered it. Okay. So then, yeah, it summarizes things pretty well, right? And in fact, Vicki, what some of our really good law enforcement does is they use Sharp to write their police report. I know John for sure is on here, and I think Lenny's on as well. If your law enforcement officers gave you as prosecutors a police report that included as much detail and information as you just saw included in Sharp, not saying Sharp itself, but they wrote a police report based on everything they found out through Sharp, would you be pretty happy as a prosecutor? Do you think it's fair to say it's probably better than some of the police reports that you get? Pretty detailed, right? John and Lenny are afraid to answer. Okay, so yeah, it's a little bit more detailed, so it could be useful in using these particular cases where we want to include information like this, right? And then I want to show you what the safety document looks like. So you should all see where it says safety management tools on the top now. And it goes through the safety document, and it uses the acronym STEPS. And STEPS stands for see what's happening. So it says basically the first step in safety planning is to acknowledge what's happened, And what I like about this is it kind of spells it out, and it says, this suggests that Patrick is stalking you. I've found this to be a really good touchstone for victims who are like, I don't really know if it's stalking. They haven't used the word stalking. It can reaffirm to them that, guess what? Yep, we think this is a stalking situation, okay? It also goes through the threats in these particular situations and what those threats are, including the escalation, the specific threats Patrick has made to destroy property, etc., that he's violated a court order. And then it talks about evidence. So it says, hey, you should probably consider writing things down and using a documentation log, okay? So it might give you some of the information that might be helpful for keeping that documentation. Now, keep in mind, the threat assessment, the SHARP tool itself, gives us some explicit information, but law enforcement wouldn't be able to use SHARP as a piece of evidence. They would have to get all the evidence that SHARP talks about. So keep that in mind. And then it goes through the evidence, it goes through protection. And so it talks about like protection orders, that kind of stuff. And then it talks about support, and it recommends to those individuals where they might seek help. Because this is a national assessment, it doesn't automatically generate the national resources. It gives our website, it gives some additional websites and some hotlines like the domestic violence hotline that people can contact for more information. So if I were to do this with a victim, if I were all of you, then I would also probably write down the local resources, phone numbers for that person. So, and John's asking, how often can a victim use SHARP to monitor or document the progression of the stalking? As often as they want to, John. So they can continue to fill it out, once a week, however. It depends on what the intensity and the frequency is in the stalking case. If things are changing on a weekly basis, I would definitely recommend that, because then if the victim were printing this out, then they would be able to show the progression. 2 months ago, I had a 5 out of 14. A week ago, I had an 8 out of 14. So it can show that escalation, which can be really important. So great question. There's no limit on how often they use it. All right. So I'm going to stop that. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. All right. So for SHARP in general, we answered all those questions. Okay. So whether you knew it or not, you answered the questions about these 14 risk factors. So let's figure out what happens in this particular situation. And before we watch this segment of the video, I would just give you a little bit of a trigger warning that you actually hear a 911 phone call that Peggy makes when Patrick breaks into a residence. So just FYI, you'll hear that phone call. So if anybody wants to take a break and not listen, you're more than welcome to.
And at this point, Peggy asked the DA, will it take a bullet to my head for you to do something about this?
With Patrick's behavior escalating, we just felt like, at least temporarily, let's get you out of here. Let's wait for this stalking trial to come up. And by that time, we can determine whether it's safe for you to move back home.
Peggy soon left for Turlock, California to begin a new life. She did everything she could to leave no trace or trail to protect herself. 6 days before her stalking trial was to happen, Patrick found Peggy after months of searching.
So how did this happen? After paying a private investigator for information, Peggy Stalker drove to the Albuquerque airport, checked a handgun and a hunting rifle at the airline counter, and flew to San Jose, California. He retrieved his bag with his weapons, rented a car, and arrived at her neighborhood. He posed as a private investigator, approached a delivery driver who recognized her photo, and gave him her exact address.
He caught up with her on her way out of the house early Saturday morning. He duct taped her hands together, he choked her, and he beat her. He beat her so severely with his gun that her blonde hair turned bright red. Despite all of this, Peggy managed to break free and flee to a neighbor's apartment where she was able to call 911.
911 emergency. I have a stalker and he's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118. He's going to dead. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it down. Does he have a gun right now? He does. He's already beat my head. If you don't get here, Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly. My head is stopping wet with blood. He gets in this house, he's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop. Female. Please stop it. I have to go. He's going to kill me. Ma'am?
The SWAT team arrived. Peggy told them, if you open this door, he will kill me.
And the police officer said, let's not talk about that, Peggy. Let's talk about your family. And Peggy had said, tell my mother that I love her. And tell my sister who's pregnant to name the baby after me. And tell my niece, Abby, she will have a guardian angel. And those were Peggy's 3 last requests before she was killed.
I just remember punching a hole in one of my walls, and I just, I started crying, and I just said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to Peggy, because, at that point you just feel that I failed her, that the whole system failed her. You just feel powerless.
The doorbell rang. I saw 2 police officers. In that instant, I knew they didn't even have to come into the house because I knew what had happened. I said, just tell me, did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister? And what I was told that night was that he had found Peggy, he had shot her in the head with a gun, and then he had killed himself. I decided, you know what? Knowing Peggy's personality, Peggy would have been on a cell phone at my funeral trying to take action, trying to make something good come out of something so tragic.
So any questions or comments about this particular case? If you would like to know more information, and you would like to hear it from Debbie directly, the sister that was interviewed on here. Debbie happens to be an amazing advocate, and she is actually the reason that we have Stalking Awareness Month. So right after Peggy's death, Debbie was watching something on TV and heard about the old program that existed to help people and victims of stalking. And so Debbie reached out to them, and they petitioned to create Stalking Awareness Month in the month of January. So I know that absolutely watching and listening to a video like that can be extremely hard to hear, especially on a Friday as you're looking at going into the weekend. And so I appreciate that all of you sat through that video, or maybe you didn't, and that's okay, that's self-care. But certainly think about how you take care of yourself this weekend, and how you continue on an ongoing basis to take care of yourself. Certainly this is a horrific example of what can happen in stalking cases, but we know that working with stalking cases and domestic violence and sexual assault cases, like all of you do on an ongoing basis, impacts all of us who are doing this work. So continue to take care of yourself in those ways as well. Anything anybody else wants to share about that video? I saw several of you saying how tragic it is to watch something like that. And, Debbie's words about, I wanted to take something really tragic and make it into something good. Debbie did a webinar with me at the end of January for Stalking Awareness Month, and she tells more about Peggy's story. And so if you're interested in finding out a little bit more information and hearing it from Debbie directly, you can get on Spark's website, and that webinar was recorded and is available to view in our archives. So you can hear it directly from Debbie. So John's asking a great question about what do we know about Patrick's past? So it comes to light eventually that Patrick has a ex-wife and a daughter from a previous relationship that Peggy was involved with and part of. and that he was manipulative and abusive in that relationship as well. And there, Debbie talks about in the webinar that she did with me about how she watched, Debbie describes it as like the spark in Peggy's personality disappeared. And she saw her sister, who was so vibrant and full of life, really kind of shut down. And so they had some insight into this particular situation, and knew a little bit about what Patrick had been engaged in, but not a lot about it. So a lot of the information about Patrick's past came to light after he killed Peggy and himself. Someone's asking, you know, does stalking often end up in someone being murdered? You know, it's very dependent. I mean, they certainly all have the potential of ending up with a really tragic situation. And so what we need to be considering is, how do we enhance the safety of the individuals that we're working with? And to more of your question, John, about Patrick's past, he was self-employed, so he could move about the country to engage in his stalking activities pretty easily. He was extremely persistent. He did have access to those weapons, and they knew a little bit about that going forward, but not a ton of information about his access to those weapons. You know, I think looking back on things, the family would say there were lots of warning signs that in hindsight they realized are warning signs, but they didn't necessarily think were at that time. And I think they would also say, and we did know that this was not a good situation. We were concerned for our sister. We did want things to go forward. And so their frustration came from in what they believed to be a very ineffective criminal justice response. Now, keep in mind, this happened 20 some years ago. And so I think we certainly have made strides in the criminal justice system. We haven't fixed everything, right? And Debbie talks a lot about that on the webinar that she did with me that's on our website. And so their ask of all of us who work in the system and out of the system is to just continue to shed light on this particular issue and to talk about the impact that it has and to take stalking cases seriously. So that's what I would share from their perspective. Certainly, if any of you are on here and wanted to debrief more about this case, because I know it's a lot to listen to, especially on a Friday, you're certainly welcome to chat me privately in the chat, and I'll stay on after the webinar is done today, or to chat any of the coalition staff as well. So let's move on to talking about enhancing safety in these particular cases then. How do we look at cases like Peggy's or others and figure out how do we move forward, right? Someone's asking at the onset, in stalking cases, it should be handled firmly and seriously to avoid the victim's loss of life. I totally agree with you, Raul. I think had there have been additional consequences and additional information provided to the family and additional safety planning, et cetera, I don't know that this could have been prevented. I mean, we don't know, but I think there certainly could have been lots of additional safety measures in place. And so interacting in these now before they escalate is really important. And I really appreciate your comment that, you know, if we can handle these at the beginning before they escalate, certainly we would all love to do that, right? So when we're working with our stalking victims and focused on the safety piece of things, we want to focus not only on safety, but on the advocacy and support, as well as the documentation. And so we talked in our first webinar about disengagement, but just a reminder that oftentimes victims might be continuing to engage with the offender because they're safety planning. In Peggy's situation, she cut off all contact. She made it clear and evident that she didn't want to have any contact with the offender. But we know that in cases like this, it's also helpful to have things that can document those situations. And so just a reminder that we have the documentation log that's available on our website for folks to be able to use in these particular cases. It's available in English and Spanish. You're welcome to download it, use it as you see fit in these particular cases to be able to give to the victims that you're working with. Can certainly help build some of these particular cases and help us document those cases. while also looking at the safety planning aspect of these cases. And so understanding that when we talk about safety planning, we're thinking about not only the practical risk reduction things, but also, and I think more importantly, putting victims in contact with a variety of agencies or individuals who can help them. So one of the things that I like to think about is, especially in areas like you're all working in, where resources might be stretched thin, or where we might say things like, well, we don't have a specific LGBT organization that helps, or we don't have whatever. There's always people in your community that are like the movers and shakers within that community. So, you know, I've worked in rural areas that didn't necessarily have a community center for LGBT victims, but it certainly had people who were part of that community that I could put victims in touch with to feel safe and supported in their community, right? So thinking about those plans that we work on, and again, remembering that it's not a piece of paper, it's that ongoing discussion about the strategies and interventions that we can use in these particular cases. It's really important to trust our victims' instinct. They are usually very spot on about this particular situation. And so asking them, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think the consequences are going to be if you file for a civil protection order, or if you go in and talk to law enforcement? And considering the fact that those safety plans should evolve in a way that considers what the stalker's next tactic is. There is a method to my madness when we spent so much time on the SLY strategies earlier, because we want to think about what the offender's reaction might be and what the next tactic they might use are, as well as understanding that when we're talking about stalking situations, we're kind of walking a really fine line in balancing safety with freedom. Very often, victims of stalking will say things like, I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. No place is safe for me. And so being able to have those discussions about that practical, safety concerns, like, do you walk out to your car at night after work? Can somebody escort you? Can you get a dog? Can you get a personal alarm? With also understanding that victims have the right to be free and to live their lives and get on social media and go to a restaurant and show up at a grocery store. And so I think some of the things that we need to be thinking about, especially in smaller jurisdictions like you're all working in, not falling into the trap that offenders often set of pretending that interaction with the victim just happens to be a coincidence. Oh, I just happened to bump into them at a restaurant, or I just happened to bump into them at a grocery store. Well, maybe in your community, there's only one grocery store. Still begs the question, why on that day at that particular moment in time, right? So being able to have those basic considerations in place when we're working with victims of stalking, and understanding that our goals are to provide some practical tips for safety, but also, I think, just as, if not more important, the empowerment piece of things, talking about coping skills. Every stalking victim that I have ever worked with, I think, has said to me either something like, I know this sounds crazy, but, and then they proceed to describe all the ways that the offender has been showing up in their life. Or after speaking with them and talking about coping skills and the emotional impact that the stalking has on their life, they'll say things like, that's like a huge burden off of me. Like, that helps so much that you believe me and that you don't think I'm just blowing things out of proportion. Okay? So somebody's asking that and saying that some agencies have safety planning listed on their agency websites. And am I worried that that gives perpetrators a heads up on what their victim might be doing? I don't think so. I think it's actually a great thing to have up there. Perpetrators usually are way more aware of resources and what's happening than victims are. A perfect example is like our shelter system across the US. People are always really focused on, let's keep our shelters for victims of domestic violence hidden. And my experience has always been every single abuser in that town knows where the shelter is. Who doesn't know where the shelter is the victims who need it. So I don't think advertising and saying what you do is a bad thing. In fact, I would be a proponent of it. I would say I can help with safety planning. To be honest, the offender is going to be put out by the fact that the victim's talking to anybody. So I don't think it gives them any extra clue. So I wouldn't be concerned about having that on an agency website at all. Somebody said, in the case of a stalker, when they cross state lines to stalk somebody, what role can or does the Department of Justice play? Whew, loaded question, John. Wow, you're really throwing them at me at the end of the day on day 4. So when we have stalkers who cross state lines, what typically has to happen is there has to be an investigation and prosecution through like the Department of Justice. So that typically will involve a specific law enforcement agency like the FBI or somebody else who will be gathering information on cases like that and then forwarding them to, say, the Attorney General or somebody else who has the power to prosecute those particular cases. Everybody's always second question is, well, does that happen? And Cynthia poked fun of my "it depends" answer. She's exactly right, because that's what I'm going to say right now. It depends. These are the examples I can give you. In Idaho, we have a couple of FBI offices, one of which is in our more populated area of Idaho, and in my direct experience has been a little less proactive in stalking cases just because they have their hands full with a lot of other things. And so stalking doesn't rise to the level that it might in other places. We also have some contacts up in northern Idaho, which in northern Idaho, you are bordered by Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Canada. That office doesn't have as many ongoing investigations as the area down here does. And so in that particular area, they are a little bit more proactive on stalking cases, partially because then they become international, partially because of, amount of resources, et cetera. So typically when we look at whether cases have reached that particular level, it's really important to consider what has also been done at the local level. And it takes a lot of great coordination between local folks and the Department of Justice. So I've had cases that have certainly been charged with interstate stalking, more so when they have gone in and out of tribal jurisdictions than necessarily state lines. But it certainly depends on whether the Department of Justice has people assigned to these particular issues, if they work on violence against women crimes, if that particular Attorney General has an interest and passion about these particular issues. That's, goes back to my mantra earlier when I want all of us to be able to be so good in our responses that we don't luck into a good response, like that every single person is amazing when it comes to these issues. So that's a really long answer, John, but the Department of Justice certainly can play a role, and oftentimes is playing a role hand in hand with local folks, because the local folks have been taking part of that information, and now the case is kind of being elevated from the local jurisdiction to the Department of Justice, if that makes sense. That's been my experience. Certainly, I have never lived in a territory, so I don't know how that differs for all of you, depending on where you live, or even how it differs for those of you that are joining us from Hawaii, which also has its own unique issues, right? So I would love to hear if you, John, have any additional information you want to offer to people, or if anybody has had a different experience with the Department of Justice. I'm more than willing to listen to that. And then the last piece of our safety planning is those resources. So understanding who your resources are. If this is an interstate stalking case, who is my attorney general? Who are, federal law enforcement contacts? What are those agencies that can help me? If I am working on a college campus, what are the resources on my campus and outside of my campus that students could access? And how much do people charge for things? What can those people do or cannot those people do? And so that when I make a referral, I know what I'm talking about. I kind of had my own policy when I was doing direct services that I didn't make a referral to an agency unless I had personally visited that agency. So I would never say, hey, go pick up a food box from the Salvation Army if I hadn't been to the Salvation Army to see what kind of food box they can get, what does it look like, where can you get it, what's the process for getting one, etc. Just because I felt more comfortable referring people places if I had direct knowledge of what I was referring them to. So something to think about. I love that the coalition was sharing that they have a website of all the local Pacific area resources. That's amazing. And I know how much work those resources are to keep track of. So that's a huge shout out to them. We also have to consider when we're doing effective safety planning that we have to be flexible with what works for the survivor and responsive to the offender's behavior. And we have to consider all aspects of the victim's life. If they're a mom, if they teach on a college campus, if they are unemployed, as well as considering the context that we've been talking about so often about what's been happening, what might happen, right? And you heard me yesterday when I was talking about the investigation piece of things, but these questions are helpful, I think, regardless of whether you're an investigator or somebody who's, a victim service provider. The what have you already done? What do you need my help doing? And what are you not willing to do? I included those because a couple of you had asked for them. So again, I find these really helpful in establishing rapport when we were talking about safety. And we also have to consider what barriers exist. So what systemic barriers exist? So to the end where somebody said, well, what if where I'm working with an individual from a marginalized community, what barriers exist if somebody, for instance, identifies as LGBTQ? Would they have to out themselves if they made a report? Or would the services be available to them at all locations? If I'm sexually assaulted in the process of being stalked, what if the local hospital is a religious-based hospital and won't give me birth control or an after pill, or like all these things we have to be thinking about, right? So keeping in mind that just because we don't think there's systemic barriers, check our privilege. Okay, are we operating from the belief that everybody looks like us, acts like us, and has the same resources as we do, right? And understanding that there's going to be some additional barriers there, as well as understanding what are those stalker generated risks. So for instance, if a stalker is law enforcement, if a stalker is in the military, and what's been the victim's life situation and the impact on their social health. Do they have friends and family that they can lean on, or have they been so isolated because of this situation that they don't have those people that they can lean on, right? So when we're working with survivors, considering things like what resources don't involve the legal system. So to the question earlier about if the offender is law enforcement or the military, who can we reach out to besides the legal system? And what do we do if the victim reports it and law enforcement, or however they report it to, the college system, etc., they're not responsive? Then what? Then we put on our advocacy hats and advocate on the behalf of our victims, right? So this is important that it comes down to a lot of times the relationships that we've built with other people. And so there may be the positives of being in a smaller community where you're familiar with other people and the roles that they play within your jurisdiction. And there can be the negatives to that where y'all know each other, and sometimes that can create, some issues as well, right? If this if the offender's inside of the system, like law enforcement, et cetera, we've talked about that earlier, that can certainly create additional barriers. And so we have to think about some of the safety risks that exist for individuals who are looking to access the system, but the offender's part of that system, right? We also have to consider that many of us feel really comfortable with safety planning with victims of domestic violence. And so safety planning with victims of stalking is essentially the same thing. If you feel confident in your ability to do that with victims of domestic violence, I am confident in your ability to be able to do that with victims of stalking. There are some unique things that happen in stalking situations. And so I would suggest that all of you access the document on our website about safety strategies. It's a safety planning document, and it can walk you through some practical things to consider, as well as additional emotional support, etc. So definitely would encourage all of you to take advantage of that on our website and download it. Okay. So let's put into play everything that we talked about for the last 4 days. Okay, this is your final. And let's think about this case scenario. So Kim's been dating Tyson for 2 years, and he calls her at work every day when she's eating lunch to see how her day's going. And he wants her to come home after work so they can spend time together. And in the last 3 months, he started getting upset if she doesn't answer when he calls. And twice in the last week, he drove to the office to find out where she was. And when she runs errands, he texts her multiple times each hour, wanting to know exactly where she's at. And she didn't mind at first, but it started to get worse after he lost his job. He started calling more frequently. He's leaving notes on her car. He emails her coworkers, and she's actually started leaving work early to make sure she's home when she says she should be. He says she should be. And she tells you that she's afraid. He's never physically harmed her, but his behavior is getting more and more unpredictable. So my first question is this a stalking case? Or is it a domestic violence case? Or is it both? Or none? Okay, I have 1 for stalking, 1 for both, 2 for both. Stalking. Some of you are saying both, right? But I would challenge you to think, would you have said it was a stalking case if I had just started off our time together talking about this particular case scenario? Or would you have been like, yep, classic DV case? Yeah, lots of us would have thought it was a classic DV case, right? So yay, that we are identifying that they're probably intersecting issues here, right? What concerns do we have for Kim? What are we concerned about? He's gradually isolating her. Yep. There's been an escalation in his behavior. Excellent. She's had to change her behavior, right? And his behavior is that coercive controlling behavior that we talked about, that jealous, that controlling, right? So we're seeing an intersection between domestic violence, because I would say, yes, this is a domestic violence situation as well, okay? A lot of coercive control. He hasn't physically hit her, but remember, domestic violence is more than just physical. And he's becoming more and more so, right? And he might try to pass off his behavior as just saying, you know, he loves her and he's just concerned for her safety, but we're seeing it for what it is. And so if Kim comes in to talk to you, what might be some of the things that you identify that you should do with Kim? No matter what your role is, what would you do in your role? I mean, I hope you're all just typing. Yeah, ask how she sees things yet. And so we might ask her what her view is of her safety, and then maybe even do sharp as part of that. Yep. And acknowledge that you're concerned for her safety. I love how Rachel's going to ask how she's doing emotionally, and that Mariana is going to acknowledge that his behavior is not okay. Excellent. Yep. I think the biggest thing is that very first question I asked you is, do you see this as a stalking case now? So that makes me feel like our time together has been successful, and that you're identifying that this could potentially be a stalking case, even though they're still together, right? So yeah, I also appreciate that the rest of you are asking, you know, what's Kim hoping for, right? Does she have a safety plan, and offering her those additional resources, right? So I want to spend the last, like, we have almost 15 minutes, but I want to jump to our website. And the reason I'm going to do so is to show you where to find a bunch of this stuff on our website, and to remind you that it's here. Okay, so I am going to hopefully share my screen. All right, so you can all see the Spark website now? So remember, we talked about how we take advantage of like Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month and everything else. Okay, so you'll see that the opening slides on our site change frequently. But here's where you can find some of the extremely helpful information. So if the about is just our mission statement, our team. If you miss me and you want to bring it up, it has my picture on it. Yay for me. But you can go to information. So if you click on information for victims, this oftentimes gets visited by victims directly, but it basically says what to do if you're being stalked. And it says, if you need help today, it gives some hotline numbers out. And then it goes through like, hey, stalking's dangerous. And it describes why it is. It gives some general tips for victims. And then it gives the resources, the behavior log, the safety planning in Spanish, the SHARP assessment. And then this is another thing I want to point out to all of you. You can either download or order brochures from us that talk about stalking. So you can either view it online, which I'm clicking on right now, and you can see the English and Spanish versions. And we also have flyer versions. So if you want to print these out and put them in like bathrooms at the college campus or give to people as a handout, the flyer version might be easier than the other brochure, because it's not as expensive to print out and fold and all that kind of stuff. So you can actually download the PDF, and it talks all about stalking and what it is. And then you can actually, there's a place here for, if you're a service provider, put your phone number. You can change this on the PDF and print it out and be able to give it to people, okay? So you can make this specific to your agency, and we would encourage you to do so. We don't care if it sparks material, just use it, okay? So you can either print it out, or if you're like, oh, Jennifer, we don't have awesome printers because we are not well funded. I really like how pretty the brochure is. Can you send me some? Why, yes, I can. Just click on here where it says order brochures. There's no cost. Okay, we'll send them to you for free. Just fill out the form. All right. Know that we're a little bit slow in sending them out right now because we're having to do them from our homes because our office isn't open. So my amazing associate advisor, Dana, is sending them all out from her home. So please just be patient with her. And then of course know that it might take a little while to get via the postal system to wherever you might be located. We also have information for friends and loved ones. So if you're working with family members, there's a video on how to support the victim of stalking. There's quick tips. The behavior log is here again. The assessment is here again. The safety planning is here again. You'll notice that things are linked numerous times on the website because nothing's more frustrating than going to a website and not finding a resource, right? Then there's information about what is stalking, and it goes through definitions, etc. There's also the documentation log in both English and Spanish that you can print out. There's the risk assessment. There's fact sheets on stalking and intimate partner violence. We have infographics on stalking and sexual assault, if you want to bring that up during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. the brochure that I just showed you, and then our resources in Spanish. Okay. As well as, oh yes, Vicky's saying thanks for providing materials for those of us with limited budgets. Until I worked at Spark, Vicky, my budget was like $1 at every agency I ever worked for. So my mantra when we started Spark was to say, we are going to create everything, and everything we're going to create is going to be free, and everything we're going to create is going to be accessible to people who need it. So thank you for acknowledging that. It's one of my frustrations that other people don't do that. So resources then is particular by discipline. So remember I said on the first day we have information for people who do victim services work. So that's the safety planning. There's tips for victim advocates. There's the link to the National Network's safety app if you had trouble with that. There's a checklist if you are doing yes, and I appreciate that someone's saying that, can we please remember that Every Breath We Take by the Police is a stalking song? A lot of times in in-person trainings, Leonardo, I will play a Spotify playlist that has stalking songs on it, and people are listening to it, and all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, these are all stalking songs. Yes, they are. This stalking response checklist, if you are a victim service provider and you work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, this is a checklist for you to say, okay, how well are you addressing stalking? And you can go through the checklist and it asks you things like, okay, does your organization provide victims of stalking? How do you address the victims of stalking? Does your website talk about stalking? Is a stalking log on your website? Do you talk about stalking on your social media? Do you have print brochures for victims of stalking? Well, now you do, because you're going to order them from us. Do you do safety? Do you do staff training on stalking? Basically, it's a checklist to say, okay, if you work with victims of domestic violence, here's how you can work with victims of stalking in a better way. Okay. And then there's information for corrections and probation folks, for prosecution. This is where you can find the prosecutor's guide. And then there's awareness education. So remember I said if you want to do a training for people in your local area, you just click on either awareness curriculum or activities and discussion guides, and it has all sorts of information that you can use to lead a workshop. So here's your facilitator guide, here's your script, here's your PowerPoint slides, here's the handouts you need, here's the videos we already did for you. And let me know if you need them in closed caption format. We just did those, so they're not available on the website, but I'm happy to send you the closed caption version. And then here's some of the webinars that we've done. And then we also have some discussion guides. If any of you have been, speaking of media, if any of you follow the Netflix series You, it's a horrible stalking situation. We actually wrote a discussion guide on it because it was really popular and lots of people were watching it. So we actually did season 1 and season 2 discussion guides. So if you're interacting with like college students and others who are watching this, using the discussion guide as a way to provide information is super helpful. Okay. Somebody said, is the sharp tool going to be included the territories instead of just outside the US? You know, Troy, that's going to be something that I bring up to the researcher, to Dr. Logan, and see if they change that to say, you know, the specific territories, or if they want to leave it as outside the US. I think it would definitely be helpful because it would give us the location. It's not going to make an impact on the assessment itself, but it would be nice if they had the territories listed. So it's definitely on my list to talk to her about today when I noticed it. So somebody said, does your organization have stalking down to a science and have a plethora of resources? Thanks, Vicki. We try. We certainly try. And then remember when I said, oh, if you want a training from Spark, so if you just go to training and request a training, the form's right here. Okay. So just type in what you want, and then either, you know, you've met half the staff, it's me and one other person. So you can just request a training. Either Dana or I will be in contact with you. So you can certainly do that. And then somebody said, where's the webinar, Patrick and Peggy? So if you just go to training archive, this is the webinar, looking forward, looking back, considering the response with Debbie Riddle. So this is the one I did with Debbie Riddle. If you want the video itself that I showed you all today, it's on YouTube. So you can just, you just look for Peggy Klinke and the stories on YouTube. Again, it's not, I mean, it's closed caption if you use YouTube's closed captioning, which we all know isn't that great. So if you want the closed caption version that we have developed, send me an email. I'm happy to send it to you. If y'all are getting the theme, anything that we have is is for you guys. Like, let me know and I'll send it to you. We don't have any like need to keep it a secret or keep things from you. Okay. And then the last but not least would be our awareness programs. So for Stalking Awareness Month, this was, you can click on videos. So some of the videos that you all saw are available for you to use in any type of services. You can push them on your social media, or you can just go to our Stalking Awareness Month information. And we also have, every January, we do a huge campaign. And so we actually have information on here for you to post on your social media sites. We give you letters to the editor that you can send. These are all the social media sites. So for every January, every year, there's 31 social media posts that you can just share on your own, okay? And we are happy to do that. And then everybody's, nothing's copywritten, nope. You are more than welcome to use it. That's my personal philosophy as a TA provider. It bothers me when TA providers have copyrights, because I didn't create the word stalking, and I definitely didn't create the response to it. I've learned from lots and lots of people over the years. So use whatever you want. We do appreciate if you would put like our logo or like thanks to Spark on our website somewhere. That would be great. Someone's asking, do we have resources for businesses? No, because we're not allowed to work with private corporations or businesses as part of our grant. So Spark is relatively new. We've only been around for 3 years. Certainly the OVW response has been around for a lot longer than that, but we're relatively new. So we only have the OVW source of funding. So I can't do stuff outside of our funding because that's our only funding. So know that we are certainly working with some of the people who do work with these businesses, because we definitely identify that private corporations and employers should be working and responding to stalking, okay? And then somebody said, can you get my email address? No, I'm gonna hide from you. If you just go here to either our team or our mission, the ways to contact us are on here, and you can do that, and our general email address. But I'm going to again bring up the PowerPoint and show you my contact information as our final slide together. So I will share that information with all of you. My direct email address, and the best way to reach me is the director at stalkingawareness.org. Now, if any of you are panicking that I just went by some slides and you're like, we didn't talk about that today, I added some extra stuff in your PowerPoints for you that talk about like the coordinated community response. We didn't get to that today, and I didn't think we would, because y'all were so great at answering all the questions and interacting with me. So no worries on that, but it's in your PDFs if you should read it at all. And I'm just putting my email address on here again for all of you. The only thing that I would ask of all of you is to please be patient with our office if you reach out to us. There are only 2 of us that cover the entire country. So especially like during January or when we're doing lots of webinars, you know, I spend 8 hours doing webinars, and then in good self-practice, I don't return emails at 10 o'clock at night. So, you know, but if you don't hear from us, send it to us again, because sometimes our spam filter filters you out, etc. So any lasting comments, questions on resources, additional information, again, you're free to use anything that's on the website. If you can put an acknowledgement somewhere that it comes from Spark, that's certainly helpful for us, because then we can show, hey, we're doing a good job about spreading the word, but not always necessary. And there's no copyright. So, all right, well then I'm going to turn it back to Taylor to give you all the closing information, because we are right at time. And I want to say again, a huge thank you. 4 days was a really long time to sit through this. And so thank you all so much for sitting through it, for being patient with me, for being so engaging. You guys have been an amazing audience. And I really hope that once this pandemic is done, that I get to meet all of you in person. So Taylor, it's back to you.
Thank you. So this is Taylor from the Coalition. And I wanted to thank Spark and Jennifer for all your time and all of the resources you've provided us. We want to thank our closed captioners, as well as our ASL interpreters who've done wonderful keeping up with all of us. I also want to thank, of course, all of you participants for doing, just as Jennifer said, sitting through this and wanting to learn. We appreciate all of that. I want to thank Polly, Ron, and Dwayne in the background for helping keep the Zoom webinar going at its best, and also all of the staff with the coalition who make this possible. We will keep the webinar open for just a little bit. So if anyone wants to chat with Jennifer, or you have any questions or concerns, please let us know. You can use the chat box. But yeah, so we'll keep it open just for a little bit in case anyone needs to debrief or anything like that. But once again, thank you so much for all of our participants, especially those who have chimed in from across the ocean. And we hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And thank you again for attending.